I'm here, my name is Deborah Voorhees, and I am a Managing Director, along with Andrew Crosby, my colleague over there, of ICTSD in Geneva. Now, ICTSD, the International Centre on Trade and Sustainable Development, was founded way back in 1996 with the mission of promoting, through trade policy, trade agreements, and trade negotiations, the objectives of sustainable development. As such, we look across the full range of areas of the intersection of trade policy and development, in particular sustainable development. And for the longest time now, we have been looking at the potential provided by the services sectors as opportunities for inclusive and sustainable economic growth. My colleague Andrew will give you more background on our extensive work in this area over the decades, almost 2 decades now. But I just wanted very briefly to say a word about this particular project that we're engaged upon. We, for a couple of years, worked on the demand side effectively, which in relation to operationalizing the services waiver, and Andrew will talk more about that in a minute too. But this particular phase looks at what can be done on the supply side to enable countries to take advantage of the opportunities that we see in this world of growing services engagement to get ahead, particularly in LDCs and LICs, to grasp these opportunities and make the most of them for sustainable and inclusive economic growth. To that end, we have done a series of preliminary country studies in East Africa. We're doing this in Southern Africa. We're doing this in the Southeast Asia and in the Pacific. Later on, we'll extend this to other regions as well. At the same time, we follow a process of looking at the substantive areas of engagement, understanding the potential relationship between services industries and sustainable development, looking at it through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are currently being agreed in New York. We look at the contribution to specific sustainable development goals, such as gender, and Professor Tabitha Nyanga will be telling us a bit more about that shortly. We look at other elements of the supply side, how you can build up supply side capacity, the relationship with investment policy, for example, and investment practice, and we'll be bringing out a paper on that later in this year too. We look at the role of aid for trade, and we'll be bringing out a paper on that as well later in this year. This is sort of the early stage of this process. And most importantly, we're going to be looking at how the regulatory environment can be an enabler for the development of services sectors. And our senior fellow, Sherry Stevenson, has been looking extensively at that. And over the course of the project, we'll be developing a whole toolkit around the development of regulatory practices as enablers. So that's the sort of intellectual leg of the project, which goes with the country study leg of the project. And this series of workshops in these regions will be replicated later on in the project, as we start first by discussing amongst each other as different stakeholders, from regulators, from ministries, from private sector, many of you are private sector representatives, from academia, to think for ourselves within this region, what are the sectors of interest and how those can be taken forward. So this meeting is the first of a series of meetings that will take place in this and other regions, but also in this region. We will be coming back here if you want us to, of course, to take this further. So that's enough about this project. I just want to mention one other thing very briefly. ICTSD's engagement isn't just about services. It is, in fact, on a much bigger scale. We are looking at East Africa in particular this year because of the upcoming ministerial conference here in December. Typically, what ICTSD does is when there is a ministerial conference, we create a platform for engagement physically next to that conference, where we ask for proposals from anybody, civil society, academia, governments, anybody, to come and host sessions of discussion along issues that are relevant to trade and sustainable development and trade policy, but not necessarily confined to the negotiating agenda of the World Trade Organization's members itself. We have it physically as close as possible so that we can inform and engage with a wide range of stakeholders on a slightly broader range of subjects. This year, we will be having the Trade and Development Symposium here in the Hilton from the 14th to 17th of December. Please feel free to pick up these brochures at the back there. Give them to your friends and anybody who is an influencer or interested in trade policy, and encourage them to come along and be part of that. Finally, I just want to introduce our team. We are here in force today. There is myself and Andrew, the managing directors. We also have Ambassador Darlington Wapi, our senior fellow with special responsibility for Africa and developing our African program. He'll be talking to you later on. And our senior fellow, Sherry Stevenson, who is our services expert with special responsibility for services. In addition, we have Vinay Ancharas, our senior development economist, who will be speaking this morning, Nicholas Frank, our program officer, and our support team, Caroline, Hector, and Valentina. So there's enough of us to take care of you very well and to engage in conversation with you. I now hand over to Andrew, who will be chairing the session and who will introduce Ambassador Ndrangu.
Good, thank you, Deborah. Good morning, everyone. So before I introduce Ambassador Ndrangu, I'd also like to just forewarn you that I'll do a little tour of the table, but first I'd like him to address us. We know Ambassador Ndrangu for many years, since his time at WTO, ages ago now, back in the 90s. We've appreciated the close collaboration and the wisdom that you brought to the negotiations, to helping us understand East Africa. So if I can now please give you the floor, I look forward to hearing from you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I start my short statement, let me say how delighted I am, because I looked at the list of the speakers today and tomorrow, and it appears as if I know more than half. Some we have interacted for quite a number of years in different topics in Geneva and also in the region. So I feel very much at home interacting with you this morning. Now, the representative of the ICTSD, it's one acronym that I always have a problem, because I am quick to say IT instead of ICTSD. The representative of Trademark East Africa, distinguished participants, let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event for inviting the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Trade to share with the participants our perspectives on the increasing importance played by the services sector in our economies and its potential for the achievement of inclusive and sustainable economic growth. From tomorrow, that is on 25th of September 2015, and the following few days, world leaders will be meeting at the UN Summit on Sustainable Development. The outcome of the high-level summit is expected to adopt 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. And I think these goals will focus on global development efforts until 2030. If you compare this with what was agreed, the Millennium Development Goals, you can see this is quite a heavy basket and will require heavy investment in terms of capital, human capital, and so on to achieve those, those goals and those targets. It is therefore timely that at this event, the relationship between services and sustainable development will be explored, and 4 country studies on services sectors, which were mentioned by the first speaker, The service sectors in Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda will be discussed, and I hope the discussion will be able to help us to chart our way forward. Distinguished participants, as we await the adoption of the Social Development Goals in New York this week, allow me to highlight some of the goals that could be directly related to the services sector, namely good health and well-being, quality education, clean water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. I picked from goal number 3 to goal number 9, except 5 and 8. The rest are service-oriented. These goals relate to health, education, environment, energy, and infrastructure services. One could easily find their classification within the GATS nomenclature. Some of the remaining goals are of cross-cutting nature. For example, Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth could definitely benefit from the contribution of the services sector. At this juncture, let me quote some data contained in the UNCTAD 2015 Economic Development for Africa report to demonstrate the place of services in the African economy and its potential contribution to aforestated Social Development Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. The report entitled Unlocking the Potential of Africa's Service Trade for Growth and Development made the following observations. The African service sector grew by 4.6%, twice the global average in the period 2009-2012. The services sector was the most significant driver of economic growth in 30 out of the 54 African countries, accounting for more than 50% of the real economic growth for the period 2009 to 2012. Service sector provided at least 1/3 of the jobs in the formal sector. The services share of employment could rise up to 80% if the informal sector was included. It notes that very vibrant services such as transport, wholesale, and retail, and restaurants are over predominantly informal, been net exporters of services. 9 of these countries were entirely dependent on tourism and travel. Only Kenya and Djibouti had other sectors contributing to the services-related surplus. However, the report notes that Africa is still marginal player in global services, export, and imports. Africa's share of global services export was 2.2%, and that of the global imports was 4%. The continent's share in services potential, therefore, remains untapped. Distinguished participants, in the light of the above observation in the UNCTAD report, allow me to pose a few questions. And the first one is, how do we ride on this growth trajectory? The second one is, how do we maximize services contribution to the structural transformation of our economies? The UNCTAD report also notes that whereas services sector has been on the rise in Africa, both agriculture and manufacturing appear to have stagnated during the same period. There is no causal link inferred in this observation. However, it is widely accepted that manufacturing cannot be competitive if the services sector is not competitive. How do we therefore enhance the interaction between the services sector and other key sectors of the economy in order to enhance competitiveness? The services agenda is pursued on several fronts, be it at the national, regional, continental, and the multilateral levels. It is critical that the agenda is aligned to all these levels. For Kenya, we attach significant importance to the services economy. Our development blueprint, the Vision 2030, has identified key services sectors that will drive our quest to become an industrialized economy by 2030. At the regional level, the services agenda is alive and well, but could be revamped. I note that there will be presentations on the EAC services landscape, and we will listen and contribute under that session. On the tripartite, that is COMESA, EAC, and SADC, the services negotiations are to be concluded in the second phase. At the launch of the Continental Free Trade Area negotiations in Johannesburg, South Africa in June this year, the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government inter alia adopted the objective and guiding principles for guiding the Continental Free Trade Area. The objectives and guiding principles explicitly state that the scope of the CFTA negotiations shall cover trade in goods, trade in services, investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy. It further states that the first phase shall cover negotiations on trade in goods and trade in services. This clearly puts the services trade on the front seat of Africa's integration vehicle that will drive us to the destination envisioned under the 1991 Abuja Treaty establishing the African Economic Community. At the multilateral level, suffice it to state that services is considered as one of the areas that could elicit consensus at the forthcoming WTO Ministerial Conference that will take place here in Nairobi in December. Indeed, this area had registered progress until the stalemate emanating from more contentious issues in the Doha Work Program adversely impacted on the momentum generated in the work in the Services Council, that is the special session. Those of you who have been following debate on services in the WTO will know that this was one of the inbuilt agenda from the Uruguay round, and the discussions, the negotiations started in 2000. And by the time we went to Doha, we already had agreed on the guidelines. So it was well advanced, and it was on, I would say, even by the time we went to Doha, services was considered to be way ahead of other subjects, way ahead of agriculture. But as I have said, it has been held hostage because of the progress in agriculture and also in non-agricultural products. It is therefore our expectation that the momentum in the services area negotiations will be regained in the lead up to Nairobi. I say that because the intensive consultations that are taking place in Geneva are showing some signs of reawakening in this sector, and we could see some results as we get to the MC10 in Nairobi. Finally, let me thank the ICTSD for inviting us to this event. I know I have posed questions. I expect that the responses to these questions and others that could be raised in the course of this event will enable us to come up with a coordinated, multi-stakeholder response that will drive the national policies, regional integration, as well as the continental and multilateral agenda as pertains to the services sector. Ultimately, all these processes should ensure that the services sector contributes to an inclusive, sustainable economic growth and the achievement of the global goals of ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So you touched on some things that, for me personally, have been long-time interests, including back when I started working on services and looking at the relative level of services trade being very low in most developing countries, but the level of growth being very high and potentially very high. And I think that's something that's of great interest to me. And I'll give you another personal data point there as well, and something that I think inspires me about being in this meeting, and I'm looking forward to meeting each of you as we go along, which is that I've been told in Geneva that, well, there's not that much happening in Africa, well, East Africa. And when I first came here, I had that little echo in the back of my mind, and I became a fan of what was happening here. And I think there are fascinating things that are happening here. So personally, I look forward to hearing about those because I think that what I've learned so far of the many businesses that are operating here, they have huge potential, a lot of dynamism. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. So before I go on, I'd like to just make a tour of the table. Just if you would, your name and affiliation, a word or two if you'd like, but really I just want to be sure that everyone understands who else is around the table. So if I can propose to go start with Darlington and just go around the U this way, and then we'll follow back up on the second table behind.
Good morning, everyone. As introduced earlier, I'm Darlington Mwape. I'm Senior Fellow at ICTSD.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Gitiba. I have been participating in the BPO sector, that's services for exports in Kenya, and also doing digitization for companies in Kenya. The organization I work for is Sept International.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Angene Getsuko. I represent an institution called WorkSafe Capabilities. We are involved in enhancing or growing occupational health and safety training, particularly in East Africa and ultimately, hopefully, in Africa. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Henry Mutai. I'm here representing the Trade Law Center, Tralac, but I'm an international trade law consultant based here in Nairobi.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Faith Sizia from Tanzania, Pan-African Company, Private Sectors. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. My name is Neema Temba. I'm a legal officer and coordinator of the Services Sector, Tanzania Private Sector Foundation.
Good morning. My name is Bede Limo. I'm a retired civil servant and a part-time consultant, Tanzania.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jovith Muhandiki. I'm a member, interim member committee of the service platform in Tanzania. I'm from the private sector.
Morning, everybody. My name is Abraham Mafurunja, interim member committee from service platform to Tanzania.
Morning, everyone. My name is Stella Nyambane. I'm from Kenya, the private sector. I represent a company, it's called Andest, where we do ICT consulting, we develop applications, we also do business process outsourcing. I am in charge of business development.
Good morning, my name is Chawe Mpande Chulu. I'm a services expert. I'm currently advising the Commerce Secretariat in Trade and Services. Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Michael Roberts. I work with the World Trade Organization. I work in the development division looking after issues related to aid for trade.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ali Gugu. I'm from Tanzania, working for the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Department of Trade Integration. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Thieno. I'm a senior economist for the Delivery Services Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister, Uganda.
Hello, Happy Mukame is my name. I'm an attendant consultant based in Kigali, Rwanda. I'm currently advising the Ministry of East African Community for Rwanda through Trademark East Africa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Bosco Kanyangoga. I'm an international trade consultant based in Kigali, Rwanda.
Good morning. My name is Susan Mwita, a retired officer from the Ministry of Industry and Trade, Tanzania. I'm now an entrepreneur and a consultant.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gerald Harry Ekinu. I work with the Ministry of Works and Transport under the Department of Transport Services and Infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. George Warusimbi Mpanga is my name. I'm a trading services expert. I represent the Uganda Coalition of Services, based in Kampala, Uganda.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Adoso Van Helepute. I'm the board chair of the Association of Uganda Tour Operators, and I also own and manage a company called Asianut Safaris and Incentives.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Mugoya. I am Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Tourism, Wildlife and Antiquities of Uganda.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Avikangaga Sam. I work as an Assistant Commissioner, Policy and Planning, Minister of ICT, Uganda.
Salam to everybody. I'm Godfrey Rutamuta from Dar es Salaam. I'm involved in providing business services to the private sector institutions in Tanzania and Somaliland. Thank you.
Good morning, Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD Senior Fellow. Thank you.
And I'm Deborah Voorhees, and everybody's seen me already.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ezra Rubanda, Head of Trade Policy, Uganda National Chamber of Commerce and Industries.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Ampeire. I work with EASI. EASI is the Eastern African Sub-Regional Support Initiative for the advancement of women, and we concern ourselves with issues to do with gender and trade. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I'm Rorian Bategana from Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives, Uganda, Department of Trade.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lydia Chirire from the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lynette Gitonga. I'm an international trade consultant based here in Kenya.
Good morning. My name is Martine Jusakidan, and I'm with the Trade Negotiations and Commercial Diplomacy Branch of UNCTAD's Trade Division.
Good morning, everyone. I am Lerato Ntlopo. I'm the National Trade Advisor on the Commonwealth Hub and Spokes project, seconded to the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Cooperatives, Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everyone. Thank you very much, everyone. It's a fantastic group of people in this room. So I'm. Did somebody just walk in? Sorry if did I miss somebody here? Recent entry at the table? Thank you. Sorry.
Nanyaro from Export Processing Zones Authority, Tanzania.
Good, thank you. Welcome. Okay, so if you'll allow me, let me just say a couple of words about ICTSD's work and services. As I told you, the early days, we started to look at the relative rates of growth and trade around services, understanding that services trade and services development could be a major engine of sustainable development. And that early work really focused on identifying what kinds of services and the levels of trade in those services relative to developed countries and developing countries. And we moved there into a process of trying to understand what were the dynamics within developing countries. And we did some country studies in the later 90s, early 2000s, looking in this continent anyway, in South Africa, and I believe we did one in Kenya. We also did in Pakistan and some other countries. Really trying to focus in on what were the dynamics there. And then we've transitioned more recently into a process that many of you are familiar with around the what's known as the LDC waiver, which is a process at the WTO in which non-reciprocal preferences would be granted to LDCs by non-LDCs. And part of that process, it was a very extensive process, which, as you know, continues. But part of our take on that process was to actually bring together LDCs in a brainstorming to understand from their perspective where the potential was, where the barriers were, to really understand from that domestic side first where there was interest and blockage, let's say. And we did this, we did country studies for some 18 LDCs, right around that number. And we did import market studies for 5 major importing countries. That was the US, France, Britain, South Africa, and India, I believe, if I've got it right. And those were set to try and understand, so what's the services environments in those countries that could be of interest to LDCs. And in this process, which was basically one of saying, well, there are potential possibilities of opening up those markets, we also became quite aware in those discussions that there was a need to talk more about what could trigger this kind of more catalytic services development that Ambassador Durango has talked about. How could we do that? So I come to the present and Deborah's presentation about where this project is. So it's a very important time, I think, in terms of our work in understanding how to bring services, trade more actively into the region, but globally as well, in the context exactly as you mentioned of the different levels of negotiation, which is something that we think is very important and something that policymakers need to be aware of as they're developing their policies. So let me come back to our agenda today and tomorrow. So the agenda is designed to take us through some discussions first about the role that services play in economies, and then to gradually focus on specific sectors. So the first session, which I will be chairing, is going to be a broader session, and we're going to focus on the services sectors broadly and some of the characteristics of services as they relate to sustainable development. And I think one of the ways that we can think about that is, services can empower transformation in multiple ways, in cross-cutting ways. So part of this first session is about how can that be? They can help empower innovation. So we had a discussion over the last couple of days about how to generate value added. And a lot of value added comes from innovation. A lot of innovation comes from services. So this is the frame that we're operating in. Now, we publish a weekly newsletter called Bridges Weekly. I just read this morning in today's Bridges that the Global Innovation Index, which is something that's published by WIPO, Cornell University, and INSEAD, identified innovation achievers, and they noted that sub-Saharan Africa, which had been more poorly performing in previous studies, had gone up quite a lot. So they cited Rwanda, Mozambique, Malawi, but also Kenya, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Uganda as all raising up in their levels of innovation. I think that's quite interesting. It reflects some of the dynamism that we're seeing and that I hope to hear about. So our first session here will focus on the panorama. How do things work together? How do we relate different aspects of services? And I think you're going to hear about some things that are obvious, but hopefully some things that are not as obvious. And so take a look at your agenda, if you will. The agenda provides a structure that is rather broken up, and I'm going to ask our presenters to shift up a little bit and to present for about 20 minutes each, one after the other. And then probably after the coffee break, we'll get into a real discussion. We'll have an hour to an hour and a half, and we'll cover some of these different topics, and we'll stir the conversation around a little bit. But I think that will be, I think that will give us a good grounding in the many aspects of that we might, many facets that we might think about in services. So let me stop there. And if I can, I'd then like to turn over to our first presenter, our Senior Development Economist, Vinay Ancharaz. So if I can give you the floor, Vinay, either here or at the podium, as you prefer. Good, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it's a pleasure to be talking to you this morning about a topic which, as Andrew just said, might be obvious. But then, as I say here, I like this quote from Merton Miller, a economics Nobel laureate. He got the prize in 1990. Obviously, he works on financial markets and finance, and he says that financial markets contribute to economic growth is a proposition too obvious for serious discussion. Now, obviously, financial markets are part of the bigger financial services agenda. So if you talk of financial markets, you can also be talking of financial services. And obviously, you can generalize this statement to services more broadly. So then the question is, this is a topic too obvious to be really discussing. But what I hope to do in this presentation is really tell you some of the things that may come out as surprising. Actually, when I was preparing the presentation, I was myself surprised by some of the numbers that came up. I think the Excellency, the Ambassador, talked about some of the numbers already, like services already representing above 50% of GDP in many countries, many African countries, contributing more than 50% to GDP growth, which is quite significant, providing at least one-third jobs, and jobs which go, a lot of those going to females. And this is something that has come up from my own research, that the services sector has a positive gender bias. It creates more jobs for women than for men. Anyway, these are issues that I'm sure Tabitha will be talking about. So I don't want to be talking about the sustainable development angle of services. Nick and Tabitha obviously will talk about that. I will stay on how services really contribute to growth and to structural transformation. So, very short presentation. I'll be just talking about three things. Why are we talking about services in the first place? How do services contribute to growth, and how do they contribute to structural transformation? Okay. Oops. Okay. Oh. I'm just trying to manage this thing. Okay. So, first thing, why services? Services, as you know, are an increasing share of trade, African trade. So when we talk of trade in goods and services, you could see that for services exports for Africa have gone up from 2005 from about 70 billion to 120 billion in 2014. And that's the most recent year for which I could get data. And that's a 75% increase over a relatively short period. And what is more interesting from this picture is that most of this increase is happening in what we call the non-traditional services sectors. So other services. So you think of transport and travel as the traditional sectors. So all other sectors typically would be non-traditional. So you can see how the segment of the graph, which is other services, okay, has been expanding in recent years. So that shows the increasing potential that non-traditional service sectors represent for Africa. Now, there are some good news and some bad news. But again, the bad news are not really bad news as such, because they show that actually there is potential that is not being tapped. And I think this point was made earlier by the ambassador. First of all, if you look at the share of services in Africa's total exports, what do we see? Well, that's the blue curve there, okay? In 2002, the share for Africa and the share for the world as a whole were almost the same, about 20%, meaning services represented about 20% of total exports of goods and services, okay? But then, over the years, and this is interesting, you see for Africa the share going down, okay? Whereas for the world, except for 2008, 2009, obviously the financial crisis, the curve has stayed more or less stable. Now, for Africa, actually, this share has declined from a peak of 20% in 2002 to about 14% in 2013. It's a decline. The gap between Africa and the world, as you could see, has been increasing. And that's not a very positive story. And then when the share of the world started to pick up in 2011, you could see a slight uptick. For Africa, the tendency is sort of stagnation, if not slight dip. Now, what does this all mean? First of all, one positive thing that this graph says, hike in 2009. It's a very interesting thing. What it is saying is that in the financial crisis, during the financial crisis, when trade actually collapsed almost as we talk about it, okay, that hasn't been the case for services trade. Services export prove resilient. And the fact that the share increased during the financial crisis actually is testimony to the resilience of the services sector. And that's a very interesting outcome. It says that if you really want to be tackling vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and that this ties up also with the issue of structural transformation that I'm going to talk about in a minute, services is the way to go. There is evidence that this is a sector that is resilient to economic crisis. The other good news is that Africa represents only 2% of the global services market, which in 2014 was valued at about $5 trillion. Only 2%. And that tells you how much unexploited potential there is. Now, services, as I was saying, have been increasing, and this has been driven mainly by technology, okay? we see increasing shares of what is called other business services, including in particular ICT related services and other commercial services, which obviously marks a shift from the traditional service sectors that I was talking about earlier. If you could read this, these two pie charts, you could see that for business services and other commercial services, if I lump them together, they represented 27% of all service exports from Africa in 2005. In 2014, the two together represented 32%. That's a significant increase. You might say it's a 5 percentage point increase, but it is quite significant because it occurred in the space of a decade. Now, so there are many stories that are emerging. I'm sure we'll be discussing in this room several of, some of the success stories that have happened in the region and in Africa as a whole. But one thing I want to mention here is the regional trade dimension of services. This is something that we don't talk about a lot, probably because data on regional services trade is generally lacking. But you just have to look at the region, and I'm just focusing on the region here, just to see the scale of regional services trade. You have stories of Kenyan professionals, working across borders in East Africa, and by that, by Kenyan professionals, I mean accountants, doctors, lawyers, other professionals. Uganda, which has been known for quite a long time now, Ugandan universities attracting students from across Africa, so education services. South Africa, which is playing quite a significant role in transport services, facilitating transit. And Ethiopia's Vision 2025, which is about making Ethiopian Airlines as taking it further, making it to the company's vision to serve African routes better, basically to tap on the growing momentum in the region. So all that is testimony to regional services trade. And mind you, this trade, it's not just that you don't have data. Even if you do get the data is likely to be underreported because to some extent, just like for goods trade, services trade also has an informal character to it. Okay, quickly, growth. Services as a vehicle for growth. How does this happen? What are the ways in which services can contribute to growth? Very quickly. First, as we all know, it's an input into the production of goods. I think the point was made earlier. And therefore, services competitiveness drives goods competitiveness, and ultimately your export competitiveness. Services as a magnet for investment. I'm going to provide some numbers to tell you to what extent services in Africa and in this region also are attracting investments. Services actually are high productivity sectors, and this might come as a surprise, but I'm going to show some numbers to make the point. And then you have specific service sectors which contribute to growth independently, not as an input, but independently. And here we are talking about health and education, for example, which improve productivity, which improve labor productivity. We are talking about public services, which are part of the broader institutional landscape and therefore have its own role to play. And then finally, competition in the services sector, which actually boosts efficiency and growth. So these are all ways in which services can aid growth. Now, the point was made earlier that services are a significant contributor to growth. Just to put some numbers, this provides you a comparison across different regions. The red one is for sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, services represent about 57% of GDP. That's the average for sub-Saharan Africa. The region is doing better. Potential is there to do better. But then it flips up. And then when you look here, you see South Asia at the highest growth, Sub-Saharan Africa second to South Asia. Why? It's like the flip side. This illustrates the idea of convergence. When you start with a low, when your share of services in GDP is low, your potential to grow the services sector is huge. Okay? And this ties up very nicely also with the idea of structural transformation. I'm going to show some numbers in a minute that shows that this idea of convergence is stronger in services than it is in manufacturing, which means that if you really want to go the path of structural transformation, services are the way to go. The contribution to GDP, and this is a chart that I take from the McKinsey. It breaks down the contribution of different kinds of services, including obviously and also agriculture, resources, and manufacturing, to GDP growth over the period 2002-2007. Okay? And if you were to add up all the services, they come to just above 50%, which again ties up with the point I was making earlier. It confirms that services are a significant contributor to GDP growth. They contribute on average more than 50%. More than half of GDP growth actually comes from services. And services growth, and this is a point that is coming from two World Bank experts on services, Ghani and O'Connell. They come up with evidence showing that services-led growth is greener and more inclusive. And I'm sure this point will be discussed further by my colleagues. Here, so this is again a breakdown of GDP growth by different sectors. I have it by agriculture, manufacturing, services. Services are the blue bars. So if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, you have it again for non-oil and oil-producing African countries. You could see systematically, except for India, except for China. And here I don't really want to spend too much time on it. Again, it goes to show that some sectors, so I don't know if you could read this, but if you look at the green one, the green bars are transport services, the orange one are financial services, the red one are business and ICT services. Let me just focus on these three, the green, orange, and red ones. And these are basically showing how much services contribute to export value added. Okay, it comes from a recent database on value added, and it shows that they actually make quite significant contributions in countries like, I've picked some African countries here, Madagascar, Rwanda, Tanzania. Services as an input into exports of goods play a quite significant role. And therefore, the competitiveness of the service sectors would determine the competitiveness of your exports. As a magnet for investment, I have here some numbers. 40% of FDI into Africa is in services. 40%. That is significant. Okay? And that share has increased actually. And this is for 2012. It was 40%, but just a year earlier it was 24%, and that shows that this share is on the rise. And again, the typical service sectors that attract the most investment: tourism, as you would expect, hotels and restaurants, but also business services, IT. And then you have regional FDI flows as well associated with services, especially cross-border banking. Okay, very quickly, this is my last part. Structural transformation. I think we talk about structural transformation, but sometimes it may not be clear exactly what we are talking about. Okay? Different people may have different notions of what structural transformation really is. So let me give you a definition. It's a process of structural change and economic diversification through which an economy moves from low productivity, low value-added sectors and activities. Okay. Now, why do we need structural transformation? I think I shouldn't even be asking this question. In Africa, and this has been shown by a number of studies, and you know it also, there is what we call a structural deficit, meaning structural transformation is elusive. You don't see it happening. We are stuck in agriculture and low value-added, low innovation, low productivity agriculture at that. Okay? How do you make the in a sort of a linear path going from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services, okay? So the question then is, well, Africa hasn't been able to make a dent into manufacturing, okay? Some countries are doing it, some countries with textiles, but it's not happening to the extent that we would wish. So some people even talk about deindustrialization or premature deindustrialization in the world. And then a point made by one important economist, actually an influential one, William Baumol, back in 1967, saying that services productivity in the services sector is bound to decline over time. If you remember the Prebisch Singer famous hypothesis that terms of trade would decline, okay? This one is along the same route, basically, that services productivity will decline because over time, as countries get richer, the demand for services will increase, but the supply of services won't be able to keep pace because, and that was his view, because a lot of services are non-traded. Okay? Third point, that good jobs can only be created in manufacturing. We are talking about engineers, we are talking about, all those things. And then the fact that there is little scope for specialization in economies of scale in services, which is true. When you think about it, when you talk about division of labor, starting with Adam Smith's pin-making example, how you can break up tasks. How about services? Do you think of specialization in services? We typically don't. But it doesn't mean that there is no specialization in services. Okay, I'm just finishing up, 2 minutes. And then this point about manufacturing, there's something there about manufacturing which makes it special, which takes on from the work that Danny Roderick, previously at Harvard, had done. He is one big advocate of manufacturing. Sales activity, other services, trade, transport and communications, systematically higher than for agriculture and manufacturing. Okay? That's just one example. But you can pick such examples from other countries, except that you don't have the data for many countries. This is one example I could get for Ethiopia. And it goes to say that contrary to what we think about productivity in services, that services is low productivity, low innovation, that is not true. Services is very much a high innovation sector. If you think about what's happening in the services, in service sectors like especially IT-related services, technology services, okay? When you think of a smartphone, for example, do you think of it as a good or as a service? I mean, just think about it. Is it a good or a service? Honestly, I don't know where I stand on that. Okay? My view is that it's more of a service than a good. Okay? And the question basically boils down to software and hardware. Where do you draw the line? A lot of the services that go into producing such goods actually are high-end services, high productivity services. These are services that are driving innovation. And the last point, okay, here, this sort of well-known smiley curve. Even in manufacturing, okay, the highest value addition really comes from services. So we are talking up here on this side. So on the left side, research and development, commercialization, those are high value added services. And then on the right side, marketing, advertising, and all that. And this is really my last slide. I happen to get this data from Ethiopia. Very interesting. It makes the point that services don't only create better jobs, but they pay better as well. These are minimum wages that I got from the government gazette from Lesotho. In textile and clothing, and it's in Rand or Maloti, a trained machine operator gets, and that's the minimum wage, 1,260. Compare that even to someone in the cleaning services sector. You might say, well, that's a basic, practically unskilled type of labor, yeah? 1,773. Gets more than in the manufacturing sector. Look at all the numbers, all these numbers, okay, are higher than in manufacturing. Can you generalize this? I can't tell. But to me, it seems that services not only are high productivity, not only do they contribute to higher growth, which is a fact which has been demonstrated, not only are they high innovation, they also create better jobs and they offer better wages. So I will leave you with the last question. And you form your own opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinay. Very insightful presentation. Thank you. And I think you left us with a big provocative question, which I hope we'll get into as well. So let me pass it over to Nicholas, please. Thank you very much.
Let me start off by saying that it's a pleasure to finally get to meet everyone. I think I've corresponded with most of you, and it's quite nice to put names to faces. So hopefully I can kind of interact with everyone after the session. This presentation will be on services and sustainable development. A conceptual approach will be adopted, the point of which is to provide you with a methodical way of thinking about the relationship between services and sustainable development. Services and sustainable development, that relationship is complex and multifaceted. So while I think we all have intuitions about how services relate to sustainable development, structuring those thoughts is very helpful. So to that end, this presentation will explain the link between services and sustainable development by looking at various channels through which services interact with sustainable development objectives. And just as a caveat, this presentation is designed to be thought-provoking and to get us to think about services in a deeper, in a more holistic manner. So the primary question is, what is the link between the development of service sectors and the attainment of sustainable development objectives? In answering this question, I hope to provide you with a series of kind of practical tools. So the first of which are a set of criteria which can be used to prioritize service sectors for further reform and further development. In addition to criteria, indicators are required in order to quantify and analyze the strength and directness of the various relationships between services and sustainable development. So if you will indulge me, I will give you a 30-second history of sustainable development, just so, because I think it's important that we define what we mean when we talk about sustainable development objectives. So in 1987, the World Commission on Environment and Development, otherwise known as the Brundtland Commission, came up with one of the landmark definitions of what sustainable development is. And I'll just read it to you briefly. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It contains within it the key concepts of 1, the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and 2, the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. In 2002, at the World Summit on Development in South Africa, the Joburg Declaration emerged, which highlighted 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic development, social development, and environmental protection. In terms of policy, we have the Millennium Development Goals, which were agreed in 2000. There were 8 of them, and they focused on things like the eradication of extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, reducing child mortality. However, the MDGs were subject to some criticism in that they were too narrow in their scope and focus. So we arrive now at the SDGs. The objective of which is really to go beyond the MDGs. So they include all of the goals fundamentally that the MDGs included, but they added a significant number of other ones. Gender issues, inequality within countries and between countries, sustainable development of marine ecosystems. So these are the SDGs, and as you can see, there are a lot of them, and there's quite a wide range. So Goal 1 is ending poverty in all forms everywhere, and then this goes down to Goal 17, which is strengthening the means of implementation to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development, and you have basically everything else in between this. So for the purpose of this presentation, the SDGs will be used as a proxy for sustainable development objectives. So I will use the terms interchangeably. Okay. So it's important the next question becomes, what is the link between services and sustainable development? Vinay has already covered the growth aspect, so I'm not going to dwell on those. But if you look at this chart, in the top bar, you have the domestic side and the international side. The red lines relate to economic growth. That blue line is the indirect growth effect. We're really talking about an income effect here. So services lead to economic growth leads to increased incomes deal with a number of the sustainable development goals. But like I said, I'm not going to speak any more on that. What I'm interested in are the direct effects and the other indirect effects that are non-income related. So in terms of the direct effect, what we are really talking about are service sectors that are directly linked to a sustainable development goal. So for example, health services directly relate to health outcomes, or educational services directly relating to the provision of primary education to everyone. The other indirect effects really relate to services inputs into other sectors or other services that then contribute to sustainable development outcomes. Okay. Why criteria are needed when speaking about services? Well, and sustainable development, given that there's 17 SDGs with 169 targets, and given that economies have finite resources, a prioritization exercise has to occur. So then the question is, how does one go about prioritizing? In order to prioritize, criteria are needed for that, to provide a sort of methodology for decision making. So the first set of criteria that can be applied is quite broad, and it's really a first cut. You can see certain SDGs directly relate to a given service sector. So that would be the first part of these criteria. The next level would be, does a target within a given SDG goal relate to a specific service sector? And finally, you may have a scenario where services are simply not mentioned in a given SDG goal or target. So again, this is quite hard to see, but it's just for illustrative purposes. So we have 4 SDG goals that make an explicit reference to a service sector. So we have ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages. This relates to health services. We have ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education. This is clearly educational services. And then we have 2 more for environmental services. the little green box is Goal 16, which is promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development and providing justice for all. Now, services, it's quite hard to make the argument or find where services fit into that. So if one applies criteria A to that list, we get to the end. It doesn't really fit. In between those two are service sectors which directly relate to an SDG target contained within the SDGs. So within each SDG, you will have a number of targets ranging from 3 or 4 targets to 10 or 12 targets, depending on the SDG. So that's what this criteria A relates to. Criteria B attempts to address the issue of backbone services in the economy. So what is a backbone service? A backbone service is basically a service with which the economy cannot function without. So financial services, communication services, transport services, construction services. Some authors make the argument that educational services and health services are backbone services. Others dispute that, but it's included. And then we get services which do not directly fall into that. So then we get things like business services, tourism services, and environmental services. So again, this is still part of basically a listing exercise to just list service sectors and sustainable development goals, just to see what the direct impacts are. Well, not the direct impacts, but to list them so you can see, for example, financial services interact with 7 SDG targets and 6 SDG goals. But the application of criteria A and B is not sufficient because it tells you nothing about the nature of the contribution of a given service sector to a sustainable development outcome. And the criteria A and B also don't tell you about the strength of the contribution, which is very important to realize. So when we talk, criteria C looks at the nature of contribution. So the attainment of an SDG target closely depends on access and performance of given service sector. So what do we mean by that? Again, going back to the health services example, to increase health outcomes, one of the sustainable development goals, health services clearly have a direct impact on that. For the indirect contribution, we're talking either about the growth effect or the input effect. The service feeds into another service which helps to achieve a sustainable development goal. So the criteria C can be applied across all service sectors. I've just picked out 2 here, financial services and tourism services. And what emerges is that financial services have quite a strong direct relationship with the achievement of various sustainable development goals and targets. There are a number of indirect relationships. So, for example, water and sanitation. That really is due to the input effect. Tourism services, the relationship is not as direct because it tends to operate through the growth channel. So as you can see, for Goal 8, which is economic growth and employment, there's a clear direct effect, which then translates into an indirect effect for many other service sectors. So now it's important to look at the strength of contribution. And this can be basically broken into 4 subcategories: strong, moderate, weak, and negligible. And what we are talking about is how the operation of a service sector affects the targets within a given SDG goal. So again, if you have an SDG with 6 targets in it, and a service sector can contribute to 5 or 6 of them, then it's making quite a strong contribution. If it's only contributing to 3 or 4, it's more moderate, maybe 1 or 2. We're talking about quite a weak contribution, and there will be cases where it makes no contribution or it's negligible. So again, if we apply that to the same 2 sectors, financial services and tourism services, along with criteria C, what is quite clear is that, for example, financial services make a direct and strong contribution to the achievement of a large number of sustainable development targets. Tourism services operate in a slightly different way, in that they may have an indirect relationship, but quite a strong contribution. But again, even in cases where a direct relationship exists, that does not necessarily entail a strong contribution. So, for example, for oceans and marine resources, Goal 14, tourism services do make a direct contribution to this, but it's relatively, it's moderate, because if one looks at that SDG, you have 6 or 7 targets within that, and tourism services simply cannot address all of those targets. They'll only address maybe 2 or 3 of those targets. Okay. I mean, criteria are very useful, but what's equally useful are indicators that allow policymakers and analysts to actually kind of crunch the numbers and compare sectors. So we have three types of indicators that I think are quite useful. You have development-specific indicators, which refer to a specific SDG. So an example of a development-specific indicator, the ratio of hospitals per 100 people for health services, the number of teachers per 100 for educational services, the number of women employed in a given service sector for gender goals, the share of the population with access to renewable energy for SDG 7, which is access to energy. So those are development-specific indicators that can be applied. For sector-specific indicators, as the name suggests, they're applied to a given sector. So for financial services, we could talk about the proportion of people with access to banking services, the number of women with access to bank accounts, the number of banks per 100 people. These are all indicators that can be generated that will give an indication of how that sector is performing. And then for horizontal indicators, these apply across sectors and goals, so they're quite broad. And here we're talking about things like the level of revenue that's generated in each service sector, the level of foreign direct investment in each service sector, the degree of international connectedness of each service sector. And just a point on indicators. In many cases, and as Vinay suggested, data is very, very hard to come by. And the point of these indicators, because there are a large number of them, is that one should be able to find data for at least some of them. So it will give you an indicator. It should give one an indication of how various sectors are performing in relation to the SDGs. So here's an illustrative example of what we're talking about by sector-specific indicators. So I'll start with ICT. This ICT indicator was constructed looking at, well, in fact, all these indicators were constructed using data from the World Bank, so readily available. This indicator looks at mobile telephone subscriptions per 100 people, just as a single proxy for ICT. For energy, we're talking about the share of the rural population with access to electricity. For finance, we're talking about the share of women with access to a bank account. And for transport, we're talking about the share of paved roads. And again, these are just examples of indicators that can be built into these various, these are just examples of different types of access indicators that can be used to evaluate service sectors. So looking at this, it's quite clear that ICT services in many countries are performing quite well relative to these other indicators that we're talking about. And that energy services, depending on the country, are okay. So, for example, one looks at Senegal, a large proportion of the rural population has access to energy. And for Afghanistan, what is quite clear is that female access to banking is very limited. So just in terms of my concluding remarks, services are complex, they're multidimensional, and their relationship to the SDG goals is very complex. What is important is to have a way of thinking about them, a kind of structured, methodical way of thinking about it, in order to prioritize sectors for development, given the constraints that governments face, in an ideal world, one would address each of the SDGs and one would focus on all service sectors, but governments simply cannot do that. So then the question becomes, how do they do that? And I think the application of criteria and indicators really is necessary to develop a holistic and kind of comprehensive approach to the development of services policy. That said, this presentation is focused on general criteria and general indicators. They most certainly can be tailored to national, domestic dynamics and kind of realities. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. You've given us a nice path into understanding how we might think about the SDGs in a very practical way. So let me now please pass the floor to Tabitha, and we'll hear about gender. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Not afternoon, I think it's still morning. I'm here to talk about gender and service sector development. And as has already been mentioned, that services are an engine of growth, it is important to ask ourselves, is that growth inclusive? Because we can have so many women or so many girls in the service sector, but they could as well be marginalized just like they have been there before. So I start by defining what inclusive growth is, and I say that it is one that provides opportunities for both men and women, especially ensuring gender equality. And this has been exemplified in the MDGs and in the Sustainable Development Goals that Nick has just mentioned, that Goal 5 of the SDGs concerns gender equality and women empowerment. And we all know that women enter the labor market on an equal basis. And most times they find themselves in jobs or in employment that's usually quite vulnerable. Now, we start by looking at how women enter, how many women are in the labor force participation, and we find that these labor force participation rates have been declining globally, and these rates have been rising in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we all know this is, and therefore they are not generally assumed to be in the labor force. And as we have, we all know, this is a truth actually, that women participation in the labor market varies greatly across countries. And of course, this reflects the level of economic development, and of course, education levels, fertility rates, and so on and so forth. And just to recap, is that female labor force participation is both a driver and an outcome of economic development. And as more women enter the labor force, we'll find that economies will grow, and they grow faster, and of course, in response to the women labor force inputs. Now, international trends will also show that women's share of labor force participation has been increasing, and we find that this still remains below that of adult males, okay? Meaning that even as it grows, it is still below. Men are more than women in the labor force. And participation of women, this is a repetition, but in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, less than 40% of women aged 25 and older participate in the labor force. Participation rates have increased in the Middle East, North Africa from 1992 to 2012, while they have fallen in South Asia. And I think this can also be deduced from what Nick has said. And this is just to show where women are. And we know that trade in services, as already mentioned, is a very dynamic sector in the global economy. And it includes trade in services, travel, other commercial services, distribution and retail, and so on and so forth. Now, despite the strong global growth, service exports continue to make up less than 25% of world exports, and the discrepancy between the size of the sector and exporters in the exports points to a major untapped potential, just as already been mentioned. Now, I've mentioned that women are found mainly in the service sector, and this we find that it's either in government or in the private sector, but most of the women and girls are found in the private sector, especially as a result of liberalization. Now, I want to look at employment and gender, employment by sector and sex, and we find that employment in the service sector has been increasing over the years, though agriculture continues to be the major employer in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Now, the ILO reports that out of 3 billion people who were employed around the world in 2008, 1.2 billion were women. That is 40.4%. And only a small proportion of employed women were working in industry, which is 16.1%, as compared to 26.4% of men. That is in industry. Now, the large majority were devoted to agriculture, that is 37.1%, compared to 33.1% for men. But in the service sector, there were 46.9% of women compared to 40.4%. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, the agriculture sector makes up for more than 60% of female employment. In other words, what we are saying is that even though the service sector has been increasing, in sub-Saharan Africa, women are still more represented in the agriculture sector. Now, what I have here, you may not be able to see the figures much, but what I'm trying to show here is the ratio of female to male employment by sector and sex in the world and in other regions. And what you'll find is that female-male ratio is more in agriculture and in services, and especially in, okay, let me just go to my explanation. That although there are more females employed in the agricultural sector compared to manufacturing in most regions of the world, that is what that table is showing, the service sector is slowly overtaking agriculture as the major employer of women in most regions of the world. Now, as late as 2013, the ratio of female to male employment shows that there were more females in employment in the services sector compared to males in the world, and it was the same story in sub-Saharan Africa in 2013. And it was only in South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa where the ratio of females to males in employment in agriculture was higher than that in services. Now, this employment in the service sector, I have now zeroed in on the service sector, and what we find, I'll just go to the explanation itself, that globally, the proportion of women employed in the service sector has been rising. In sub-Saharan Africa, the proportion of women employed in the service sector was 27.4% when we started the MDGs in 2000, and it rose to 31.6% in 2013, compared to 25.5% and 28.4% of males during the same period. Now, what we are saying is that despite such positive developments that resulted in the increase in women employed in the service sector, what we find is that sub-Saharan Africa's performance in female service employment remains slightly below that of most developing and developed regions. So here we are in Africa, we need to think about that. Now, the next thing is women are employed in the service sector, we have said, but how are they faring? Are they in management or are they just employees? And what sort of work are they doing? Now, when women participate in the service sector, most of them are mainly employees and not owners of enterprises. And those in employment are usually in the lower cadres, and very few rise to positions of management, or what you call the glass ceiling. And I'm sure it's only a few of us who would say that we have broken the glass ceiling. The majority are usually below that ceiling. Now, female participation in ownership of service farms and proportion of female top managers of services farms is higher compared to manufacturing. In other words, there are more women who own service farms compared to those who own manufacturing farms. And the answer to that is that it is easier, mainly small farms, and especially in Africa. Now, coming to our own region here, the East African community, what I'm trying to show here is the proportion of farms with female top managers and the proportion of farms with female participation in ownership as late as 2014. And what we find that Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, only Rwanda had female top, Kenya 13%, female participation in ownership. Now, Kenya was the best with 49%, Rwanda 43%, Burundi 35%, Uganda 26%, Tanzania 25%. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that most farms, service farms, they are actually owned by men. Number two, that even those farms that are owned by men, majority of the top management is male. Now, what does that tell us? That most of the decisions regarding employees and the kind of work that they do is usually by men. Now, this is what I was trying to show there. Now, but what comes out is that hotels and restaurants and wholesale and retail trade perform best in female employment. Female participation in ownership and female top managers, we show that most women are concentrated in low and mid-skilled occupations. So even though we are talking about sustainable development, even though we are talking about inclusive growth, this growth is not inclusive. Now, I take a few of the service sector. I take tourism, I take financial services, I take transport, and see how females fare, and especially the type of work that they do. And I start with tourism, and what we know is that this is a huge employer of females because it is mainly labor intensive, therefore being a source of female employment. Now, globally, the overall percentage of women participation in tourism labor force is 55.5%, quite big. But we also know that tourism is highly gendered. And of course, it draws on gender inequalities that provide a huge global supply of what we call highly flexibilized and low-paid female workers and potential tourism employers. Because we know that most of the people who work in the hotel, tourism, and so on and so forth, this is, they usually use what we call the women's nature, the nurturing nature of women. And what we are saying is that there is significant horizontal and vertical segregation of the labor market within this sector, the tourism sector. Now, women are placed in different occupations. They are employed as servers, cleaners, travel agency salespersons, tour guides, and so on and so forth. Now, men are employed as bartenders, porters, gardeners, maintenance, and construction workers. And of course, why, when you ask yourself, servers, cleaners, now these are mainly what women do at the household level. In other words, we are actually using what is generally accepted as women's work at the household level as what they do now when they are employed. In other words, what we are saying is that women are employed in roles that are considered representative of their domestic roles using the same skills base. And of course, employers take advantage of the social and domestic skills acquired by women through gender role socialization. And they hire women for jobs involving what I've said, cleaning, serving on people, and nurturing children, and of course, making beds. Now, in the hotel and tourism and catering, employment is very temporary. You're giving today, tomorrow you don't have of the sector, and of course this affects most women, the employees, because it is easy for them to be laid off. Now here I have a table that is trying to show women employed in hotel and restaurant by occupation and status, and what we find is that there are more women in service and as clerks than as professionals. And on average, 44.7% of women are employed as service workers, 59% as clerks, and only 36.8% as professionals. And of course, what I'm trying to show here is that there are more women in service and as clerks, but very few as professionals. And of course, now it means that men are employed in areas that are usually considered malish, as property managers. They're looking at food and beverage. Although that, when it comes to the household, at the household level, is women who are usually doing that, but when it comes to the hotels, it is the men. When it comes to chefs, it is men, but when it comes to at the household level, it is women who are supposed to be cooking. Now the next one is information communication and technology, but what is coming out here is that this sector is also highly gendered, and employment of women is far in the minority than it is for men. And even when those women are employed in the ICT, very few of them find themselves in management. For example, in South Africa, 51% of those working in the ICT are women, 51%, but only 22% are employed in formal jobs. Meaning, I was saying that they are in the informal sector, and we all know the hazardous nature of the informal sector. Now, in India, women form only 21% of all software professionals. In Europe, only 6% of networking professionals are women. In the UK, women form only 20% of ICT workforce, and they are concentrated in lower-level operator and clerical roles, with only 15% of ICT managers and 11% of ICT strategy and planning professionals being female. So essentially what is coming out is that even when women find themselves in the ICT sector, the sector is highly gendered, and women are still found in the lower levels of employment. And we are also saying that only 6% of chief executive officers of top 100 top global technology companies are women. They are underrepresented at all levels in the ICT sector, and especially in decision making. And what we are saying is that in the ICT industry, women tend to work in softer and less technical areas, rather than the more technically viewed areas of programming, networking, and engineering. I'll now look at financial services. And here we are saying is that despite making more than half of the workforce in the financial institutions, women continue to lag behind their male counterparts in leadership roles. And studies have been done, and what was found in 20 global markets show that women comprise nearly 60% of employees in the financial services industry, but only 19% progress through the leadership ranks to senior levels. They only hold 14% of board seats and a mere 2% of CEO positions. And when they reach middle manager level, the trajectory, they become more or less stagnant. And I know my time is going, so let me go to the next one, transport and logistics. Now, here we are saying that transport is one of the sectors that are usually considered not good for women, because it involves, either pushing and pulling, driving trucks, being away from the family, and so on and so forth. But what are we saying here? That women are massively underrepresented in the transport sector, both in absolute sense and in comparison to their participation in the national labor market, okay? And the primary cause of women's low participation women, the nature of a woman is she needs these services, okay? And the timing, the place of work, and of course the gender stereotyping. And of course we also know that in most areas women are not supposed to be driving anyway. Now here what I'm trying to show is proportion of women in transport, storage, and communication for selected African, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries. And what you will find in the pay is higher, that's where most men will be found. Okay, what I'm talking about here is the functional structure of women's employment. And what we are saying is that women's employment in services is mostly concentrated in low-skilled, low and mid-skilled occupations such as clerks and service workers, shop and market sales workers. What are we saying? That the women don't have the same opportunities to access the full range of service occupations as men, who are represented in craft and other related trade. They are in managerial registry of occupations. We are also saying that even when women work in the same occupation as men, they have fewer responsibilities, lower pay, lower status, for reasons that are not attributable to their experience. Now, I've also mentioned that women are directors, and only a few countries like directors. There are 21% in Sweden, less than 2% in the Bahrain, and of course very few in African countries. And we have what we call tokenism, that even when we have policy that women should be, for example, here in Kenya, we have what we call the 2/3 rule, that when we are appointing people in certain positions, then we should observe the 2/3 gender rule, but it is there on paper, but highly disregarded by most employers, especially in the private sector. But even in government, that one is usually overruled. Now, we also have what we call prevalence of non-standard forms of employment. Now, what are these? Now, most women find themselves in what we call non-standard forms of employment. These are employment, the kind of employment that covers work that falls outside the scope of a standard employment relationship. These are mainly in terms of temporary employment, temporary agency work, where you're on call. When there is something to be done, then you're called. If there is nothing, then you don't have work to do. Then we have what we call ambiguous employment relationships, especially in the private, in the informal sector, and also part-time employment, as we have seen in the hotel and tourism. And this, how do they affect women? Now, these forms of non-standard forms of employment, they are usually cheaper. The women who are employed in these sectors are usually paid low salaries. And of course, the employers take advantage of that because the labor is cheap. They're usually what we call non-wage costs. And women, of course, are not given certain benefits such as leave, the incidence of total employment. And what we are finding is that in Africa, in the service sector, 11.5% of services are usually in terms of temporary employment. And then in Latin Latin America and the Caribbean, 11.9%. But on average, what we are saying is that 11%, if you take the average, especially in the service sector, 11%, or about a third of countries have temporary employment or around this mean, meaning that women who find themselves in the service sector usually find themselves doing non-formal kind of employment. Now, and of course, this also varies across country, as that table has shown. But then, I'm wrapping up. That's why I'm trying to hurry up. Yes. We also have what we call a gender gap, that even when men and women have got the same skills, they are paid differently. And the reason is not usually because of their experiences, but because of other reasons. Yeah? And some of the reasons they usually say is women are usually seen as economic dependents. It is the men who are breadwinners. They are heads of household, which was, or it was designed mainly for men. Gap, a gender wage gap, which cannot be explained by reasons to do with experience, to do with the qualifications, and so on and so forth. Now, if we come to our own country here, is that females in Kenya earn 70% of male earnings, while in Tanzania they earn 65%. In Burundi, they earn 83%. This is the table that's trying to show the gender gap. And as I've mentioned, wage equality, you'll see that even when it comes to the earnings themselves, in Kenya, using US dollars, you find that males earn 2,238, while females earn 2,054. In Tanzania, there's still a gender gap, Uganda, a gender gap, but the question is, why? It's not explained. Now, I'll go very fast, leave entitlement. We are finding that there are certain recommendations, especially, given now, this leave could be maternity leave, and of course, when you're on maternity leave, you're supposed to be paid. And the generally recommended weeks is how many weeks? 14 weeks plus. You're also supposed to be paid. But what you, you're supposed to be paid 2/3 of your previous earnings. Now, this usually does not happen, and some countries have actually adhered to that, but majority of countries in the world do not adhere to that, and they don't go according to the recommendations. And even men who are supposed to participate in the bringing up of a child, especially in the initial stages, they are also entitled to paternity leave. At least in Kenya, we are doing well, but in the private sector, especially because of the informal nature of employment in the service sector, you find that women are not entitled to that. Now, there is also what you call decent work. Now, what you'll find in most countries that women will, as I've mentioned, they are supposed to be working, as we usually take advantage of their domestic nature, and the kind of work that they're supposed to do is work that will not be considered as decent. You find, you remember what happened in Bangladesh, where women are supposed to be locked up in the export processing zones, stitching. They are even, if you have to go to the toilet, then you have to seek for permission, and of course, the number of minutes are counted for you. Of course, women need much more than that. Yeah, so we are saying that especially the export processing zones and also in the service sector, the kind of work that women do is not what you would call decent work. And of course, we are saying that precarious work, or what is not decent work, is also disposable work, because it's very easy to dispose of, because you look for various reasons to dispose of that person who is not adhering to the rules that you've actually imposed on them. Okay. And of course, what we are saying is that there is need when there is no basis for segregation, when there is no basis for discrimination, then women and men should be paid the same. And what we are saying is that women's economic empowerment can be achieved through equal access to and control over critical resources and opportunities, an elimination of structural gender inequalities in the labor market, including better sharing of unpaid care work, because as we know, women will work the same number of hours and then they'll go and continue work at home. Now, women find themselves in a situation where they are not able to negotiate for the kind of able to negotiate on the wage. Why? Because they are also underrepresented in unions. Okay? So, measures are needed to increase both overall employment opportunities as well as women's employability if they are to make a transition into better forms of employment or to be in a position to negotiate fair returns to their labor in their existing jobs. And with this, women can achieve economic empowerment. And of course, I have a couple of policy recommendations, which you look at them yourselves, because I think I don't want to annoy Andrew, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Tabitha. So you made it absolutely clear. We have a differential structure. So we have on the table, I think, a lot of information, including the role of services, including the structure of services, including differential impact around services. We'll talk. We come back in 15 minutes and we'll have a discussion on all of this. Bring your challenging questions, please. I'll leave you with one. What's there, and they were referring to investment from China. We take what's there and we think about the impacts of that later because it's there. Okay? What we heard today, I think, was a way of thinking about how we can be strategic. I'm not advocating the take it and not think, but the strategic is also a highly challenging one. So come back with your challenging questions in 15 minutes. Thank you.